Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to the deep dive, where we take complex source material, filter out all the noise, and really just give you the core of what you need to know. Today, we're looking at a perspective that, uh, well, it fundamentally redefines the entire structure of religious authority for a lot of people. We've been digging into some really rigorous research presented by Joseph A. Islam on QuransMessage.com. And the core argument is simple, but at the same time, it's pretty radical. It's that the Quran is the only required, the only complete, and the only necessary source for a believer's guidance and law.
And that mission is just so critical because for you to really get the power of this argument, you have to understand the context it's pushing back against. I mean, the common, widely accepted framework for guidance includes the Quran, of course, but also a lot of secondary materials.
Right, like the ahadith.
Most famously, the ahadith, that vast, vast collection of the sayings and actions of the Prophet, which, were compiled centuries later. And you also have sources like Hadith Qudsi. These are specific narratives where the prophet claims he's repeating the direct divine words of God, even though they aren't actually part of the Quranic text itself. So the perspective we're digging into today, it fundamentally questions the need for and the authority of all of those secondary collections.
It's a very direct, I almost say aggressive move right from the start.
Yeah.
The source isn't just arguing that secondary sources are, unnecessary. It argues that the very belief that they are necessary can't be proven from the Quran itself.
Exactly.
The central question it poses is simple. Show me. Show me where the Quran unequivocally demands that you use other sources for mankind's guidance.
And it claims there is, and I'm quoting here, not one unequivocal statement that requires them.
Which puts the entire burden of proof back on those who rely on that external material. It just completely shifts the ground of the theological debate.
Oh, it absolutely does. It moves from defending the Quran's sufficiency to demanding a clear textual justification for ever looking elsewhere. It's like asking to see a clause in a constitution that explicitly allows for external amendments.
That's a great way to put it. So let's unpack that challenge. Those who support secondary sources, they often point to passages requiring obedience to God and the messenger. But this source argues that those passages, when you really study them in their original context, they just can't be referring to the later compilations of hadith.
And this is where the historical lens is so important. I mean, the formal compilations, the canonization of the hadith, the very books people rely on today, that didn't happen for hundreds of years after the Prophet's death.
Hundreds of years.
Yeah. So if a verse from the 7th century commands obedience to the messenger, how could that possibly refer to a written collection that didn't even exist until, say, the 9th or 10th century?
It couldn't.
The source argues it's a reinterpretation after the fact. It's not the original divine command.
That makes perfect sense. It's a very clean chronological critique. If that command was given during the prophet's lifetime, the obedience required must have been immediate.
Right, to the message he was delivering right then and there.
Not to some future scholars compiling historical narratives.
And what's really fascinating here is that the source claims the Quran actually speaks out against relying on other narratives. And it does this using the very Arabic word that, names the secondary literature.
Wait, really?
Yeah, look at verse 45.6. It says, "These are the verses of God that we recite to you with truth. Then in what hadith after God and his ayat will they believe?"
Wow. So hadith just means statement or narrative.
It does.
So the source is arguing that the Quran itself uses the term hadith to specifically question any human narrative that a believer might prioritize after God's own verses.
That's the argument. It's a powerful internal critique. It kind of turns the name of the genre against the genre itself. The point is, if the book is enough, then by definition, any other narrative has to be subordinate and potentially, a distraction.
Okay, so let's shift to the prophet's specific instructions then. His direct mandate. If his job wasn't to generate a whole secondary body of law, what was it?
Well, the source highlights these repeated commands that are directed solely, and I mean solely, at the revealed text.
For instance, verse 6.155 tells believers regarding the Quran, "And this is a book which we have revealed as a blessing, so follow it." The command is totally unambiguous. Its object is the book.
And the prophet himself was told to strictly follow the inspiration, the wahi. We see this pattern again and again. In 10.109, he's told to follow that which is inspired in you. His role, according to this view, was to be a faithful conduit, not an independent lawmaker.
That distinction is so key. The source is basically using the prophet's own words from the Quran to draw a hard line around his authority. He says in 10.14, "I follow not but what is revealed unto me. If I were to disobey my Lord, I should myself fear the penalty of a great day.
He even says in another passage that he doesn't claim to have secret knowledge or God's treasures. He says, I but follow what is revealed to me.
So if the prophet himself keeps insisting his whole function is limited to following the inspired text.
Then the source argues that we have to accept that his personal sayings and actions, while, historically interesting, they just can't carry the same weight of divine guidance for all future generations.
So the conclusion of this whole first section is pretty clear. For mankind's timeless divine guidance, the Quran was the only revelation the prophet received for his mission to warn humanity.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source is essentially saying the prophet set an absolute limit on himself. If we respect his fear of deviating from that divine inspiration, we could also fear adding to his designated role.
Now, this leads us right into the second massive pillar of this argument. The Quran's claim to its own self-sufficiency. I mean, this is where it gets really interesting, because if the prophet didn't provide all the details, the book must provide them itself, and the source argues that's exactly what it does.
Exactly. If you have a foundational legal document, and that document repeatedly states, I am complete, I am detailed, I contain the clarification for everything, why would you go searching through centuries of external commentary to understand the basics?
It's a great question. So what specific language does the Quran use to make this claim of completeness?
It's very specific, focusing on particular Arabic terminology. First, the Quran is described as explained in detail, using the word mufassalan.
Mufassalan.
Right, in verse 6.114. And that verse is so powerful because it asks, shall I seek for judge other than God? When he is the one who has sent to you the book, explained in detail. It directly links that detailed explanation to God's exclusive authority as the judge.
So it's not just detailed, it's God's detailed explanation. There's no room for a secondary explanation from anyone else.
Precisely. We also see the verses described with a related term, fusilat, which means perfected, and moreover explained in detail in a couple of places. But maybe the strongest internal claim comes in 16.89, which says the Quran provides clarification of everything. The Arabic is tibyana likulli shayn.
Clarification of everything. I mean, that's an ultimate claim of totality. But let me just play devil's advocate for a second.
Please.
Because this is where a lot of people get stuck. If the Quran is this complete, how does the source explain the practical stuff? How do you know how many times to bow in a prayer or the specific rituals of pilgrimage? Things that are traditionally taken from the prophet's practice, recorded in the ahadith.
That is the number one counterargument, and
Yeah.
the source has to address it. And the way this perspective deals with it is by making a distinction between the spiritual core of guidance and the practical mechanics of a ritual. They argue that the Quran provides the foundation. It gives you the ethical parameters for acts like prayer or fasting, but the detailed procedural mechanics, the exact angle of bowing, the specific words you say, those are cultural or historical practices that evolved over time.
So they're saying the core purpose, that spiritual connection and submission to God, is perfectly clear in the Quran. That's the only timeless guidance you need. The other details are just inherited historical method.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes that the ultimate explanation rests with God. It goes from chapter 75. Do not move your tongue with it to make haste with it. Again, on us rests the explaining of it. If the explanation belongs to God, then we should rely only on the text God revealed, rather than compiling our own external explanations.
Which brings us directly to judgment, consequences, and the ultimate legacy of the revelation. If the stakes are this high completeness versus deviation, what are the theological consequences the source talks about?
The warnings are incredibly severe, and they're aimed at anyone who would seek judgment from any other source. The source points to 4.105, which states the book was sent down explicitly to judge between people as guided by God.
Yeah.
So adding a secondary source is seen as, contaminating the sole source of divine judgment.
And what about for the prophet himself? I mean, what's the consequence for the ultimate authority figure if he were to deviate?
The standard is absolute. The source highlights a passage, 69.4447, where the prophet is warned that if he were to invent any sayings in God's name, if he attributed something false to the divine, he would be seized and his heart's artery would be cut off immediately.
That is a staggering consequence. So the source is implying that this verse means that every single thing attributed to the prophet outside the Quran has to be viewed through this lens.
It creates an almost impossible standard for the truthfulness of those later compilations.
And there's more, right?
Yeah. The prophet is also warned in another place that if he were to even incline slightly away from what was revealed, He would taste an equal portion of punishment in this life and an equal portion in death.
The implication being he must have rigorously stuck only to what was revealed.
Exactly. Any claim that he legislated independently has to be considered suspect.
But this perspective doesn't just reserve these warnings for the prophet, it also warns anyone who fails to judge by God's revealed scriptures.
It does. The source references several verses in chapter 5, which are talking about previous scriptures like the Torah, but it applies the principle broadly.
And what are the terms used?
Those who don't judge by revelation are given a series of increasingly strong theological labels. First, they're called kafirun, which means disbelievers or concealers of the truth. Then zalaman, wrongdoers or unjust. And finally, fasikun, which means transgressors.
And those are not light terms.
Not at all. They carry profound theological weight, and the source connects them directly to rejecting the sufficiency of the book as the basis for all judgment.
Which brings us to the very end, the legacy. The source argues the prophet's only legacy for divine guidance was the Quran, and this is cemented by what is expected to happen on the Day of Judgment.
This is the mic drop moment for this perspective.
Go on.
Think about it. If secondary sources were truly necessary for guidance, then on the Day of Judgment, when humanity is held accountable, we should expect the complaint to include the denial or abandonment of those necessary things, the Sunnah, the Ahadith.
But the source points out that's not what the Quran says will happen.
Correct. The source cites 7.51, which mentions only our verses being denied. But the definitive passage is 25.30. It captures the messenger's one and only complaint. He doesn't complain that people abandon his historical practice or later commentaries. He says, truly my people took this Quran for just foolish nonsense, or they abandoned it.
So the one recorded complaint from the messenger on the ultimate day of accounting is that the Quran was abandoned.
That's it.
According to this source, that fundamentally closes the door on the necessity of any other sorts of guidance. So what does this all mean for you? We've just walked through a perspective that argues that the Quran's internal message, its claim to be detailed, its warnings to the prophet, its stance on judgment, confirms its own sufficiency and denies the need for any other source.
The core insight for you to take away is the rigorous method being used here. It relies entirely on textual evidence and definitions found within the Quran to critique practices that evolved outside of it. The whole case just rests on the idea that the revealed text is complete, it's self-referential, and it needs no external commentary to fulfill its mission.
Which leaves us with a final and I think pretty provocative thought for you to consider. Given that this perspective asserts that the only guidance mentioned on the Day of Judgment is the Quran, and the Prophet's only complaint is that the Quran was abandoned, how does that fundamentally change the way one must approach the entire history of Islamic scholarship and the interpretation of divine law? I mean, does one have to dismantle centuries of tradition to follow the text alone? Thank you for diving deep with us today. We hope this exploration has given you a clear, critical understanding of this powerful and really rigorous interpretation.